The following story is from a collection called Tales from the Old V-Dub. If you enjoy it, please like the video and maybe subscribe to the channel. If you really enjoy it, click on the link in the description below and you will be able to buy the book. This story is called Eloise. The tiny village of Hope Cove clings to the last crust of land between the long rolling hills of South Devon and the long rolling waves of the sea beyond. It consists of a mere cluster of cottages huddled together in the shelter of a rocky headland. As the long narrow lane from the nearest town finally emerges there from between its high hedges, there is a choice of two paths a visitor might take. The first crosses a tiny stone bridge beneath which a freshwater stream is delivered thankfully over a final sparkling waterfall onto a little sandy beach, where it offers warm paddling to the local children before meandering down to meet the rising tides. On the far side of the bridge is the village's only shop, a rickety construction of timber and thatch, beyond which the path fades away amongst the coarse grass and jagged rocks of the headland. The second path a visitor might take veers off before the bridge and winds its way down between the cottages to end up at the little landing jetty where the fishing boats bring in their catch. But before that, the path goes past the village's only pub, the Anchor Inn. It was along this path that Eloise was making her way one autumn evening. She was a little nervous as she'd only moved recently to Hope Cove, but she'd been told that the evening after market day was when the villagers had a get-together at the inn and that she should definitely go along. Eloise was keen to fit in and make friends in her new home, so she had put on her best dress, slightly mended though it was around the hem, and that's where she was heading now. Life wasn't easy for Eloise, as she was bringing up two young children on her own ever since her husband was lost at sea. They said that he had gone overboard in a violent storm. But in a dark pub in Plymouth, one of his drunken shipmates had confessed to Eloise, from the bottom of a glass of grog, that her husband had jumped ship on purpose as they passed by an exotic island full of beautiful native women. "More than enough to go round," slurred the sailor, turning towards her with a leering grin. But Eloise had left abruptly, and he found he was talking to an empty stool. Whatever the truth was, Eloise was left to bring up Tom and Jane with only a meagre seaman's pension, and she quickly learned to speak her mind and fend for herself. She was an excellent cook, kept a neat house, and her children were well dressed and polite. But she grew tired of the pitying glances and the whisperings of the sailors' families in Plymouth, so she had moved her little family to Hope Cove to make a fresh start. As she pushed open the door of the pub, she was greeted by the pleasant aroma of wood smoke from the large inglenook fireplace at the end of the room, and the warm yeasty tang of good beer as the landlord pulled a frothing pint of ale for a customer. Eloise glanced around, returning the welcoming smiles of the assembled villagers as she did so. Then she exchanged a couple of words with the two sisters that she recognised as her immediate neighbours. Gladly accepting their offer of a seat, Eloise said that first she would get herself a half of stout. Heading towards the bar, however, she was overtaken by another newcomer who seemed to barge past without even noticing Eloise. It was this woman of middling years, dressed in elegant town clothes, who attracted the attention of the landlord first. "You there?" she called to him, rapping her knuckles on the bar. "Ivor," replied the landlord, disregarding her rudeness. "Yes, a dry white wine, please, Ivor," said the woman primly. As Ivor turned away to pour the drink, he raised an eyebrow towards his wife, but the woman carried on talking to his back in a louder voice. "I thought I'd come along and introduce myself," she announced. "My name is Morgana Despair." The whole room went suddenly quiet. "It's foreign," added the woman after a pause. "Not from Cornwall, are ye?" challenged the landlord, wheeling round with a bar towel scrunched in his fist. "Goodness me, no. My ancestors were French," said the woman smugly. "They came over with the Normans." This cast no further light, as nobody present knew any Normans. Morgana Despair took a sip of the wine and shuddered visibly, before resetting her smile and continuing, this time addressing the whole pub, since everyone was now openly listening. "I have recently taken over the little shop across the way there, you see, and I wanted to meet you all." "I can't believe old Sid is gone," broke in the landlady in a wailing voice. "He was stood right where you are now," she said, pointing a finger at Morgana Despair. "I'll never retire from that shop," he was saying. "They'll have to carry me out of there in a box." A week later, they did just that. Poor Sid. "Yes, very sad, of course," said Mrs. Despair. "But by pure coincidence, I happened to be in the area looking for a opportunity, and, well, here we are," she said, smiling weakly at the glum faces all around her. "Anyway," she continued breezily, her high heels clacking across the flagstone floor, "I hope to see you all in my little shop. Do bring along anything you might want to sell, and we'll see if we can't do some business together. It'll save you all from having to traipse up the hill to Kingsbridge Market every month now, won't it?" A murmur of resignation followed the woman out of the door, before the general chatting resumed and someone gave her wine to the pub's dog. Fortunately, Eloise made a much better first impression that evening, chatting with her new neighbours and being introduced to some of the other villagers. The following morning was fresh and blustery. The seagulls weaved and hovered above the beach, their feathers puckered by the wind, waiting for the perfect white rollers below to toss up an unlucky crab or two for their breakfast. Once she had seen the children off on the school bus, Eloise decided to cross the bridge and investigate the little shop. Clustered around the doorway, lots of little windmills span round gaily on their sticks, surrounded by all manner of buckets, spades and blow-up toys for the beach. Just inside the window, Eloise couldn't help noticing a pile of fruit scones on display. "Look good, don't they?" came a voice, causing Eloise to turn with a start. It was Mrs. Despair, the new owner, and it seemed as if she had been expecting Eloise. "I have them specially brought down from London on the train, but the villagers tell me that you are quite the cook. Perhaps you'd like to try one? I would so value your opinion." Before Eloise could protest, Mrs. Despair had disappeared into the back of the shop with one of the scones, through a colourful beaded curtain that concealed her little kitchen. "I just put a little butter on it for you," she said, returning with the scone, now cut in two on a little plate. "I make it myself," she added with an ingratiating smile. Eloise was embarrassed and felt she couldn't refuse, so she took one of the scone's halves and took a small bite while the shopkeeper watched expectantly. Good manners or no, Eloise couldn't help wrinkling her nose at the strange, bitter taste. "Well, I could make better scones than that in my sleep," she said, and dropped the rest of the scone into the bin, disturbing some wasps that were hovering around the used lolly sticks. Mrs. Despair's face twitched with anger, but all she said was, "I'm so glad to hear that," and her cold grey eyes followed Eloise as she crossed back over the little bridge towards home. That night, Eloise had put the whole incident out of her mind as she tucked Tom and Jane up in their beds and then retired for the night herself. But the children hadn't been asleep long when they were woken by a crashing noise from downstairs. They rushed down the cottage stairs to see Eloise walking out into the street wearing just her nightdress. "Mum, where are you going?" Jane shouted after her, but Eloise didn't even turn around. The two children quickly put on dressing gowns and slippers before dashing out into the night after her. They soon caught her up, but Eloise wouldn't answer any of their pleas. "She must be sleepwalking," whispered Tom to his sister. "We'd better be careful. You're not meant to wake them up." Jane's eyes grew wide with surprise, but she nodded in reply. "Let's see where she goes," she hissed, and the two children hurried to catch up with their mother, who was by now crossing the little bridge towards the shop, all its windows dark and its roof shining in the silvery moonlight. Once over the bridge, Eloise crossed the lane and turned off to the side of the shop. Here there was a little garden gate that led to a rough path onto the headland. Now the children were really getting worried, as this was a dangerous place in the dark and Eloise might stumble and fall onto the rocks in her sleep. But rather than follow the path higher, Eloise suddenly alighted on a rusty metal door set into the rock face and all but hidden behind the weeds and the long grass. Without hesitating, Eloise opened the door with a jarring screech and quickly disappeared inside, leaving Tom and Jane feeling suddenly cold and alone under the huge starry sky. They waited there, huddled together and shivering for what seemed like an age, listening to the rhythmic crash of the waves on the beach below. But Eloise did not return. After some more frantic whispering, they finally plucked up their courage and followed their mother through the heavy door. Once inside, they had to grope their way in the dark down a winding set of slimy stone steps to what felt like a sandy floor. Then the tunnel gradually widened out and they saw a flickering light up ahead. Afraid of what they were about to discover, they inched their way around some huge damp rocks that marked the end of the passage and finally gasped at the strange scene before them. In the dim glow of some ancient-looking torches attached to the walls, they saw Eloise hunched over a flat stone in the centre of the cavern. Her eyes were open, but she looked to be in a trance as she worked away at something on the stone before her. The sleeves of her nightdress were rolled up above the elbows and her arms were covered in flour. To her left was a big pile of what looked like soft dough, and to her right a growing pile of little white cakes, all ready for the oven. Eloise was making scones in her sleep. Tom and Jane could hardly believe their eyes, but there was nothing that they could do except wonder what on earth was making her do this. They didn't dare wake their mother, and yet she showed no signs of tiring. On and on worked Eloise as strange purple and green shadows from the torches danced over the craggy ceiling above her. The only sounds were the distant sloshing and gurgling of the sea somewhere in the depths of the cave, and the thud of Eloise's rolling pin as she kept adding to the growing pile of scones. Eventually, the children thought it best to return home and try to get some sleep themselves. Perhaps tomorrow they would think of what to do. Sometime around dawn, Eloise must have returned to her own bed, as that's where she woke up with a start the next morning. She felt incredibly tired as she hastily prepared breakfast for the children and feared that she might be coming down with something. Tom and Jane could tell that Eloise had no memory of her night's wanderings, and they thought that perhaps after all it wouldn't happen again. So they decided not to bring it up in front of their mother, waiting instead to discuss it between themselves on the way to school. At this same time, in the little shop at the end of the bridge, a couple of the other villagers had taken the bait and had called in to try and rustle up a little business with the new owner. The two men were waiting in awkward silence as Mrs. Despair had insisted that they should try her new coffee blend before disappearing into the back to prepare it. Meanwhile, they looked about themselves with their hands in their pockets and quietly marvelled at how so many items could be crammed into such a small shop. Everything you could ever need was there, from dustbins to dominoes, and just as well since it was the only shop for miles around. "Here we are then," came her voice finally, her syrupy smile materialising one slice at a time as she pushed her way back through the clinking strands of the beaded curtain. "I always find coffee puts everyone in an agreeable state of mind, don't you?" The two men eagerly sipped from the proffered cups before just as quickly putting them down again on the shop counter and changing the subject. "You might want to have a butcher's at this lovely basket of veg I've bought," began the first villager, a stout, jolly-looking man in a tweed jacket, with the red cheeks of someone who lived constantly out of doors, except when he was in the pub. But his offer fell on deaf ears, as the shopkeeper had turned her attention towards the second villager. This was Harry the Hat, so called because he always wore a sawdust-covered trilby. He was the local wood carver, and under Mrs. Despair's watchful gaze, he was turning over in his hands a huge novelty wooden fork that he had selected from the many goods on display and was now inspecting with exaggerated care. Probably Chinese, I'd say. Ironic, really, they're not big on cutlery as far as I know. But to be quite honest, if you manage to sell any of these, I'll eat my hat, he added with a chuckle. Mrs. Despair reached over and tersely relieved him of the fork before replacing it on its hook next to a similarly gigantic wooden spoon amongst the other souvenirs. "How about some carved antelopes instead?" offered Harry, unperturbed. "On a little stand, for the mantelpiece, you know. Perennial favourite, sold loads of them." But Mrs. Despair seemed unimpressed and was turning now to her other visitor. Or what about gonks?" pursued Harry. "Cute little fellas. The wife gets their hair from the village cats, you know. Good for stress management," he added, looking pleased with himself. "He's a dab hand at those gonks, all right," chimed in the other villager. "He certainly knows his stuff, old Harry," he offered in conclusion, feeling that the morning was slipping away. But Harry was just getting going. "Everyone's different, you see. Give me a block of wood and I can see the trap form inside, waiting to be released." And as he said this, he opened his hands like a bird taking flight. "Strange, really, that so many of them turn out as Vikings, then," snipped Mrs. Despair, turning again to her other visitor. "And you are?" "That's Reg, ma'am. The folks round here call him Reg the Turnip," said Harry, as the other man heaved up onto the counter a large basket filled with the most splendid vegetables, bursting with goodness and still shiny from that morning's dew. "But shouldn't it be Reg the Veg?" asked Mrs. Despair, looking slightly confused at the contents of the basket. "It has more of a ring to it, don't you think? Oh, but your coffee's getting cold, gentlemen." "It's a long story, ma'am," said Reg, casting a warning eye at Harry. "But moving on to business then, what'll you give me for this little lot to sell in your shop?" "Well now, they're very nice, so I'll give you 1 shilling apiece for the whole lot. How's that?" said the shopkeeper without a flicker of guilt. Reg gave an involuntary snort that forced some of the vile coffee to come out of his nose. He snatched up the basket of vegetables again and turned swiftly towards the door. "I'd rather give them away for free than sell them at that price," he shouted over his shoulder. "And if that man gives away so much as a mouldy potato for free, I'll eat my other hat," said Harry, grimacing over the last gulp of coffee as he dashed after his friend, not wanting to be left behind. Outside, he narrowly missed bowling over Tom and Jane, who were there in their school uniforms, with their noses pressed against the glass, examining a lovely pile of newly baked scones that were heaped inside the shop window. "They certainly look like Mum's scones," said Tom. "But why on earth is she making them in a smuggler's cave at night without telling us?" demanded Jane crossly. When they nervously went inside to ask the shopkeeper about this, Mrs. Despair was just returning from the little kitchen with a fixed smile and 2 glasses of her special homemade lemonade. After listening patiently to the children's questions, she explained to them that Eloise was perfectly wide awake but wanted to get on with her work undisturbed, so she could earn a little extra money for the holidays and that they weren't to worry. In fact, she made them each promise, as they winced over the sharp lemonade, that they would forget all about it. At first they pretended that they would forget, just to be polite, but strangely, by the time they left the shop to catch the school bus, they couldn't even remember why they had gone there. That evening, after supper, a yawning Eloise tucked Tom and Jane into bed. They said they were too sleepy for a story, to the relief of their tired mother, who then climbed into her own bed and was immediately asleep. An hour or 2 later, though, Eloise arose once again and, without waking up in the slightest, headed outside and across the little bridge in only her nightdress. She once again found the secret rusty door and once again worked all night in the mysterious cave beyond. Only a slight dusting of white flour on her sheets in the morning might have given a clue as to Eloise's sleepwalking, but she found herself too tired now to even notice such things. If Reg had set off just a little earlier that morning with his day's produce, he might have crossed paths with Eloise as she shuffled homewards. But as it was, the village streets were deserted as he pushed his cart along in the growing light of dawn. On the cart was a big basket of plump vegetables, the pick of that day's crop, all grown with painstaking care on Reg's allotment. He was heading, as usual, up to the Kingsbridge Road, where a local farmer would load up Reg's wares on his tractor and take them to market for him. But someone rising early to check the weather or the height of the tide from their window that morning would have seen Reg suddenly veer off from his normal route and direct his cart over the little bridge instead. He would have then watched with interest as Reg, seemingly in a daze, unloaded the basket of vegetables from the cart and placed them on the doorstep of the little shop, before turning swiftly on his heels and pushing the cart homewards. In fact, Reg had been in a daze, and when he arrived home with the cart, he looked around himself for the first time that morning and wondered what on earth he was up to. He next went to his allotment, but was puzzled to see that there were no vegetables ready to pick that day, so he must have gotten ahead of himself. He scratched his head and then his bottom. He then counted off the hours until opening time on his fingers and decided he may as well have 40 winks in the shed. For the rest of that week, the little shop did a roaring trade. Each morning the smell of fresh scones wafted over the little bridge and drew the villagers over to buy one for their breakfast. Whilst there, they paid good prices for those lovely fresh vegetables that the shopkeeper found on her doorstep each day and took it upon herself to arrange in tempting displays. As there was no other shop for miles, the villagers had no choice but to pay the high prices set by Mrs. Despair, and she smiled smugly to herself as her till filled with money each day. She sold everything from lollipops to light bulbs. Somebody even bought the huge novelty fork for some lucky couple on their wedding day. Tom and Jane couldn't understand why their mother was so tired all the time, of course, since their memory of that night in the cave had mysteriously vanished, and from then on they slept soundly in their beds each night. Eloise, on the other hand, went around dragging her feet and looking more tired each day. She couldn't understand why everyone in the village was eating those awful scones, but as the week went on, still more delicious cakes and pastries went on sale at the shop. It seemed that whatever ingredients Mrs. Despair put out in the cave, the sleeping Eloise could work miracles with them, and never realised that she was feeding the whole village. Harry the Hat, for his part, hadn't managed to produce a single gonk, or anything else for that matter, to sell at the shop. He was feeling quite unsettled, and he'd lost his best hat. So he was wearing his spare one, a flat tweed cap, still covered in sawdust of course, when he ran into Reg outside the pub. Likewise, Reg had been wandering aimlessly around, quite out of sorts. "It must be a bad year for veg, and that's all about it," he said to Harry with a sigh. He would have been shocked indeed to hear that not only was his allotment actually doing better than ever, but that also he was giving away the vegetables for free each day with no memory of it at all. The two friends decided that thirst could very well be at the root of the problem and retired to the Anchor Inn to remedy the situation. As the weekend approached, the clear autumn weather seemed to break. Dark clouds began to pile up on the horizon and white caps dotted the steely grey sea. As the door of the little shop was pushed open, a cold blast of wind followed Ivor the landlord inside, setting the Devon tea towels dancing on their pegs. Mrs. Despair waited haughtily to hear what it was that had made the landlord cross the road. "Just wanted to let you know the latest, ma'am. Being good neighbours and all that. They say there's a whopper of a storm coming tonight." He paused here for effect, but there was none, so he continued. "The whole village will be having a lock-in in the pub for the duration. Friendly drink, nice bit of warmth and shelter. Why not come and join us? Get to know us a bit better." "Talking of drink," replied Mrs. Despair with a sudden breeziness, "I was wondering if you'd like to taste some craft cider I brought in. Perhaps you'd like to sell it at your pub." Saying this, the shopkeeper turned her back for a moment and sprinkled a little powder of some sort into the open neck of a cider bottle before turning back and offering it to the landlord with a beaming smile. "Do have a sip, Ivor. See what you think," she encouraged. He obediently took a long gulp from the bottle, but then gagged painfully as he tried to stop himself spitting it straight back out. "It's artisanal," proffered the shopkeeper by way of explanation. "Quite good, isn't it?" "Are you pulling my leg?" said Ivor, wiping his mouth in disgust. "Well, why don't you pull the other one? It's got bells on." Mrs. Despair, clearly affronted, her eyes widened in anger. "Have a taste yourself if you don't believe me," blurted Ivor, thrusting the bottle towards her. Without thinking, the shopkeeper snatched the bottle from Ivor and took a large mouthful of the cider. "Delicious," she pretended through gritted teeth. "Yes, well, no hard feelings anyway," said the landlord. "Will we see you tonight then, in the pub?" he added, rubbing his hands together. "I'm here to make money, not spend it across your greasy bar. And as for getting to know you all, I'd rather go to sea in a bucket," sneered the shopkeeper, still fuming and letting her mask slip for once. The landlord was taken aback and raised his eyebrows in surprise, but he knew when he was wasting his time, so he turned and hurried out of the door, his left leg jangling like Santa's sleigh bells all the way back to the pub. By the evening, the predicted storm had grown to be a certainty. A proper gale was howling all around the little headland, whipping the waves up to crash against the rocks and making the timbers of the old pub creak like an old sailing ship going round the Horn. One by one, the villagers arrived to take up the offer of a safe harbour and a warm fire for the night. As the evening wore on, the rain began to lash ever harder against the pub windows, and the villagers gathered nearer the fire to swap stories about great storms of the past. The landlord tried to keep everyone's spirits up, delivering drinks around the room and adding more logs to the fire. Everywhere he went, his steps were accompanied by a jolly ringing sound that caused general amusement. "I didn't know there'd be Morris dancing either," said one villager, searching the landlord's legs with a puzzled grin. "You never know what to expect round here though, do you, matey? Ain't that the way of things?" asked Ivor, patting him on the shoulder. "Aye, that's certainly got a ring of truth to it," replied the villager, winking at the others amidst a burst of laughter. "Where's your hat, Harry?" asked Reg, returning from the bar with a pint. "Fancy not wearing one on a night like this," he said, ruffling his friend's hair. "It's the weirdest thing, Reg. I can't find it anywhere," said Harry, who looked a little green round the gills. "That's 2 hats in a week," he continued, burping uncomfortably. "I was just having my bit of lunch yesterday, sat on the bench as I do. I was having a bit of a daydream, and when I came to, my hat was gone. I think a seagull must have had it. I've felt properly poorly all week. I reckon it's the stress." Harry stared depressed into his untouched Guinness and added, "My other one disappeared on a lunchtime as well." The villagers nearby shook their heads good-naturedly and were about to start ribbing Harry for a bit of fun when the pub door was flung open and in burst Tom and Jane, the rain flying in behind them in torrents before they were able to force the door closed again against the gale. The children quickly looked around the gathered faces. "Isn't our mother here?" cried Tom in a panic. The villagers all shook their heads sadly, and Jane started to cry. "She had fallen asleep in front of the stove at home," said Tom. "She seems to be tired all the time these days. I'd put a blanket over her. But next thing, she was gone. She's not in her bed, and now she's not here. Where can she be?" Tom was starting to cry himself now. He jumped in fright as something heavy crashed over in the howling wind outside, and a feeling of dread came over him. "One thing's for sure," said the landlady, kneeling down to comfort the children. "It's too wild a night to go out there looking for her. The sea is right up on the road, and that wind would blow you off your feet. You must both stay with us here where it's safe and wait out the storm. Come along now." And saying this, she put warm blankets round the children and settled them next to the fire to dry. The villagers exchanged worried glances, but nothing more was said, and they just sat and cowered as the wind tore at the roof tiles and screeched down the chimney, making the flames dance. Finally, around daybreak, the wind died down to a low moan, and the rain against the pub windows began to ease. A search party was quickly organised, and as the villagers emerged hesitantly into the first grey light of day, a terrible sight met their eyes. The lane between the pub and the little bridge was thickly strewn with seaweed that had been thrown there by the violent waves, and the bridge itself had been dashed into a great pile of stones that now filled the river below. But most astonishing of all, the little shop was gone entirely. The shocked villagers clambered across in disbelief to an area of flat rock where the outline of the shop could still be made out. Nothing else remained to be seen except for a few coloured strands of beaded curtain. Tom and Jane were beside themselves with worry. If the storm could sweep a whole shop away, what chance did their mother have? The landlady put her arms round the children to comfort them, and they slowly made their way down to the beach to join the other villagers. The tide had retreated a little, but the sea below was still taking spiteful lunges and slapping the rocks of the headland like a boxer on his last legs. The villagers scanned the little bay for any sign of the shopkeeper, but the only thing they spotted was a little out from the shore where the water deepened. A shiny metal bucket was being tossed this way and that before finally sinking with a gurgle and disappearing beneath the dark green waves. Tom and Jane watched this sad little drama, and their last hopes for Eloise seemed to sink along with the bucket. They both buried their faces in the landlady's coat and wailed with sorrow. She hugged them tightly to her, but suddenly their wails were joined by a new sound. A rusty screech from somewhere up above made the landlady look up. At first she couldn't see where it had come from, but then a movement high on the rocks of the headland caught her eye. "There, up on the cliff! A door!" she shouted, and everyone turned to follow her pointing finger. They all watched in astonishment as the secret door slowly creaked open and out stepped, blinking into the daylight, a very confused-looking Eloise, her hands and hair still covered in flour and dark rings below her eyes. Tom and Jane shouted with joy and sprang up the rocks to meet their mother. The other villagers gave a hearty cheer of relief as the little family were reunited. The happy scene was interrupted by the rain, which suddenly began to pour down again. "Come along, everyone," said the landlord. "Let's get back inside. First one's on me to celebrate." And as the rain came down harder still, "Quickly now, shake a leg," he called to them and waved his left foot, expecting to raise a laugh with the sound of bells. But no sound came. "And I'll buy a pint for anyone who can find my hat," called Harry. "Either of them." The whole village repaired to the Anchor Inn again for a hearty breakfast and to talk over the strange events. Nobody could really explain it, but in the coming days, Reg found his allotment was suddenly back to full production, and Eloise also felt back to her old self. With her newfound energy, she began to supply the pub with all sorts of delicious food to sell, and even worked behind the bar sometimes for a little extra money. Harry finally gave up looking for his missing hats and bought a new trilby, which was covered in sawdust by the end of the first day. So he's back to being Harry the Hat again. The little bridge to the headland was rebuilt in time, but the villagers decided that they were doing quite all right without the shop. On the flat area of rock where the shop had stood, they placed a bench so that they could sit and look out at the sea on nice evenings. On the backrest of the bench they put a little plaque that read, "Live ye in hope, not despair."